Let me start with something uncomfortable. The most dangerous fear in adulthood is not fear of failure. It's not fear of losing money. It's not even fear of dying. It's the fear that this exact version of your life might be the one you never escape. Not because it's horrible, not because it's tragic, but because it's ordinary. And that thought is far more unsettling than we like to admit. When you're young, life feels elastic. Every mistake can be corrected. Every path can be redirected. You can reinvent yourself at 22, at 25, at 28. There is this subconscious belief that everything is still open, but somewhere in your 30s or 40s, something shifts. You wake up one day and realize your routines have hardened. Your habits are no longer experiments, they're structures. Your job isn't a temporary phase, it's a trajectory. Your relationship isn't casual, it's intertwined. Your identity has weight now. And that's when the quiet question appears. What if this is it? Not, what if my life is terrible? Just, what if this is the scale of it? That question doesn't scream, it whispers, usually at night, usually when you're not distracted. And it terrifies people. Because adulthood isn't built around possibility. It's built around maintenance. Maintenance of income, maintenance of health, maintenance of relationships, maintenance of reputation. Maintenance is responsible. Maintenance is mature. But maintenance doesn't feel alive. And deep down, adults are afraid that they traded aliveness for stability without fully realizing it. Another fear adults carry, but rarely articulate, is the fear of invisibility. Not loneliness, not abandonment, invisibility. The idea that you are functional but not significant, that you are useful but not impactful, that if you disappeared from the system you inhabit, it would adjust within weeks. This fear is uncomfortable because it sounds narcissistic, but it's not about ego, it's about meaning. Human beings are wired to want their existence to matter beyond survival. When adulthood reduces you to a role, employee, provider, partner, parent, you can become efficient without becoming fulfilled. Roles are powerful. They give structure. They create identity shorthand. But roles are not essence. And sometimes, in the silence between responsibilities, a thought emerges. If I stop performing my role, who would I actually be? That's not a productivity question. That's an existential one. And existential questions are rarely welcomed in busy adult lives. Which brings me to another fear, the fear of slowing down. You would think adults are afraid of chaos. They're not. They're afraid of stillness, because stillness removes distraction. When you're busy, you don't have to evaluate your life. When you're productive, you don't have to question direction. When you're needed, you don't have to ask whether you're fulfilled. Busyness is socially rewarded avoidance. But the moment life slows down, a quiet weekend, a canceled plan, a long drive alone, something surfaces. You start to notice dissatisfaction you've been postponing. You start to hear internal questions you've been muting. You start to sense misalignment. And misalignment is frightening because it suggests change. Change in adulthood is expensive. It costs time. It costs money. It costs stability. It costs reputation. Sometimes it costs relationships. And adults understand cost deeply. So instead of confronting misalignment, many choose adaptation. Adaptation feels safe. It says, this is fine. It says, be grateful. It says, this is what maturity looks like. But the body knows when you're living out of alignment. It shows up as irritability, as chronic fatigue, as subtle resentment, as emotional numbness, not dramatic breakdowns, just slow erosion. There's also the fear of honesty, not honesty online, not honesty in theory. Real honesty, the kind that changes things. If you admit that you're unhappy in your career, you can't unknow that. If you admit that your relationship feels stagnant, you risk destabilizing a shared life. If you admit that you feel behind, average, or unfulfilled, you confront your own expectations. Honesty in adulthood is not cathartic, it's disruptive. And disruption threatens structure. Structure is what adults build their sense of safety around, which is why so many people choose filtered truth over full truth. They don't lie. They dilute. I'm just tired. It's a phase. Everyone feels this way. Maybe. But sometimes the deeper truth is, I built something that doesn't fully fit me anymore. And that sentence carries consequences. There is another fear that sits underneath almost all the others. It's the fear of responsibility. Not responsibility in the practical sense, paying bills, raising children, showing up on time, Adults handle that every day. I'm talking about existential responsibility. The moment when you realize something uncomfortable. You participated in building the life you're now questioning, even through inaction. Not choosing was still choosing. Not speaking was still speaking. Not leaving was still deciding to stay. That realization is heavier than failure. Failure can be blamed on bad luck, on circumstances, on timing. But responsibility? That's yours. And once you see that you shaped your current trajectory, even passively, you lose the comfort of helplessness. There's a strange comfort in believing life happened to you. It's painful to admit you helped design it. That's when a deeper fear appears. What if my life reflects my compromises more than my potential? Compromise is not evil. It's necessary. It makes relationships work. It makes societies function. But repeated compromise without reflection slowly reshapes identity. You compromise once to be practical, twice to avoid conflict, 3 times to preserve stability. And years later, you're living inside a version of yourself built more from negotiation than conviction. That's terrifying to confront. There's also a financial fear adults rarely admit honestly. It's not the fear of poverty. It's the fear of a ceiling. The possibility that this income level, this professional status, this level of recognition is as high as it goes. We are raised on a simple formula: work hard, improve, expand. But adulthood introduces complexity. Effort does not always equal growth. Talent does not always equal opportunity. Stability does not always equal momentum. And when someone quietly suspects that they've reached their plateau, something destabilizes inside them. It's not greed, it's agency. The fear is not, I want more. The fear is, I can't grow beyond this. That challenges identity in a profound way. If growth stalls, who am I becoming? Then comes the fear of being too late. Too late to switch careers. Too late to rebuild your body. Too late to leave a relationship. Too late to chase something creative. Objectively, change is always possible. Psychologically, change becomes heavier with time, because time increases stakes. At 22, reinvention costs little. At 42, reinvention affects families, mortgages, reputations. Adults don't fear change itself. They fear the cost of change, and so they calculate. They run internal simulations. What if it fails? What if I regret it? What if I destabilize everything and end up back where I started? This is where stagnation begins, not in laziness, in risk assessment. Adults are not reckless, they are cautious. But caution can quietly become confinement. And here's the subtle part. The longer you stay inside a structure, the harder it is to distinguish between loyalty and fear. Are you staying because you believe in this life, or because you're afraid to test whether another version is possible? That question alone can keep someone awake at night. Another rarely discussed fear is comparison fatigue. When you're young, comparison feels competitive. It pushes you. In adulthood, comparison becomes evaluative. You don't just compare achievements, you compare trajectories. You notice who advanced faster, who seems more fulfilled, who reinvented themselves successfully, who figured it out. And even if you don't want their life, you want evidence that reinvention is still available. Because if reinvention feels unavailable, stagnation feels permanent. And permanence is frightening. This is why many adults stay busy. Busyness creates motion. Motion simulates growth, but motion is not the same as direction. You can move constantly and still remain misaligned. And that realization leads to another layer of fear. What if I don't actually know who I am anymore? At some point in adulthood, identity becomes less about discovery and more about performance. When you're young, identity is fluid. You experiment. You try on versions of yourself. You fail publicly. You change your mind without shame. But adulthood slowly replaces exploration with roles. You become someone's partner, someone's parent, someone's manager, someone's employee, someone's provider. Roles are efficient. They are socially reinforced. They give you structure and recognition. But roles are not essence. And that's where another fear hides. If you remove my responsibilities, who am I? That question is destabilizing because many adults realize they built their personality through adaptation. You became reliable because reliability was required. You became calm because chaos was punished. You became practical because dreaming wasn't rewarded. Adaptation is intelligent. It helps you survive. But survival is not the same as authenticity. And when you pause long enough to notice the difference, something shifts. You start sensing a quiet misalignment. Not dramatic unhappiness, just subtle misfit. You're competent, you're functional, you're responsible. But something feels slightly off. And the fear beneath that misalignment is this: what if I never really figured out who I am? Not because you're confused, but because you were too busy functioning. Functioning can hide emptiness extremely well. You can build a career, maintain relationships, raise children, handle responsibilities, and still have no clear answer to a simple question. What genuinely excites me? Not what impresses others. Not what feels responsible. Not what makes sense. But what feels alive. That's when another fear appears. The fear that it might be too late to explore. Exploration in adulthood is expensive. It costs time, it costs reputation, it may cost comfort, and adults are deeply aware of cost. So instead of exploring, they freeze identity. They say, "This is who I am," and they stop updating. But internally, evolution doesn't stop. There's friction between the fixed version of you and the evolving version of you. That friction shows up as restlessness, or irritability, or a low-level dissatisfaction that never fully goes away. Then there's the fear of aging without meaning. Aging is not frightening because of physical change. It's frightening because of perceived narrowing. When you're young, life is measured in potential. When you're older, life is measured in trajectory. You notice patterns. You see which ambitions accelerated and which plateaued. You recognize your habits solidifying. And a question arises: have I already peaked? That question is rarely voiced, but it's felt. It's not necessarily about career. It's about energy, about intensity, about the sense that your most vibrant version may have existed earlier. Maintenance becomes the dominant mode. You maintain your body, maintain your income, maintain your relationships. Maintenance is honorable, but maintenance does not feel expansive. And humans crave expansion. This is where the fear of irrelevance enters. Not being understood by younger generations. Not adapting fast enough. Not feeling needed in the same way. We don't fear wrinkles as much as we fear becoming predictable. Predictability provides safety. But too much predictability can feel like stagnation, and stagnation threatens meaning, because meaning is often tied to growth. If growth slows, meaning feels threatened. That doesn't mean your life lacks value. It means your internal narrative expects momentum. And when momentum feels reduced, fear whispers, "Is this all there is left?" There's one more layer beneath all these fears. It's the possibility that fear itself has been designing your life. Not in dramatic ways, not in obvious disasters, but in subtle, reasonable decisions. Fear rarely screams. It sounds rational. It says, "Be careful." It says, "You can't afford to lose what you've built." It says, "Now is not the right time." It says, "You're too old for that." It says, "What if it doesn't work?" And those sentences sound mature. They sound responsible. The problem is not fear. Fear protects us from real danger. It prevents reckless behavior. It forces evaluation. The problem begins when fear becomes the default decision maker. When you choose a career primarily because it's safe. When you stay silent primarily to avoid discomfort. When you remain in situations primarily to avoid uncertainty. That's when fear shifts from advisor to architect. And most adults don't notice the shift because nothing collapses. Life continues, income arrives, bills are paid. Responsibilities are met, but internally something feels restrained. And that's where another uncomfortable distinction appears: the difference between caution and avoidance. Caution expands awareness, avoidance shrinks possibility. Caution says, prepare carefully. Avoidance says, don't move. Caution is steady, avoidance is tense. You can often feel it physically. If imagining a bold decision fills you with panic and contraction, fear may be protecting you. But if imagining it fills you with fear and aliveness at the same time, that's different. Aliveness is important. Growth almost always contains fear. If there is no fear, there is usually no growth, which leads to another adult anxiety: regret. There are two kinds of regret: the regret of action and the regret of inaction. The regret of action is sharp but temporary. You try something, it fails, it hurts, but the story moves forward. The regret of inaction is quieter. It lingers. It returns in quiet moments. It whispers, "What if?" Many adults choose inaction because it feels safer in the short term, but long term, inaction often carries more weight. Not because every bold move succeeds, but because stagnation erodes vitality. Adulthood is often misunderstood as the elimination of risk. In reality, adulthood is the negotiation of risk. Stability carries risk. Change carries risk. Silence carries risk. Honesty carries risk. There is no risk-free version of life. The only real question is which risk aligns with who you want to become. And that brings us to authorship. The deepest fear may not be failure, aging, or invisibility. It may be losing authorship over your own life, waking up one day and realizing you've been reacting rather than choosing, adapting rather than directing, maintaining rather than shaping. Authorship does not mean control. Control is an illusion. Authorship means awareness. It means recognizing where fear has influenced you and deciding consciously whether to continue in that direction. It means understanding that discomfort is not always danger. It means allowing fear to inform you without letting it command you. Adulthood is not about becoming fearless. It is about becoming aware enough to choose deliberately, to stay because you believe in staying, not because you're afraid to leave, to speak because it aligns with you, not because silence feels safer, to change because growth matters, not because comparison pressures you. And maybe the most mature thing an adult can do is admit, "I am afraid." Not as weakness, but as clarity. Fear does not disqualify you from growth. It accompanies growth. It signals importance. The goal is not to silence fear. The goal is to understand it and move anyway, carefully, consciously, intentionally. Even if your hands shake a little, that might be the most honest definition of adulthood.